Back during the Vietnam War, Texas computer billionaire H. Ross Perot, and former presidential candidate, he decided that he would give a Christmas present to every American prisoner of war in Vietnam. Some of you may know the background of Ross Perot is that he was heavily involved in the recovery of our POWs and MIAs from the Vietnam War. So during that war, he decided he wanted to give a Christmas present to every single POW in Vietnam. David Frost, a reporter, tells the story. He said Perot had thousands of packages wrapped and prepared for shipping. He chartered a fleet of Boeing 707s to deliver them to Hanoi. But the war was at its height, and the Hanoi government said it would refuse to cooperate. No charity was possible, officials explained, while American bombers were devastating Vietnamese villages. The wealthy Perot offered to hire an American construction firm to help rebuild what Americans had knocked down. The government still would not cooperate, the Vietnamese government. Christmas drew near, and the packages were, at that point, unsent. Refusing to give up, Perot finally took off in his chartered fleet, flew to Moscow, and his aides mailed the packages one at a time at the Moscow Central Post Office, and they were all delivered intact. Sometimes when you have a plan, sometimes when you have hope of something ahead, things come up to interfere, don't they? Sometimes when you're living based upon a promise for something to come, sometimes though that promise gives you great encouragement and optimism, sometimes things arise to make you think that promise is no longer going to come to fruition. And in those days and in those times, moving forward is the best option. When you are banking on a promise of something ahead, when you are certain of a goal that you know you want to reach, when you are certain that God's put in your heart a desire to accomplish something, and at those times when you are moving toward that promise and obstructions come up in front of you, and you feel like you might be stopped, moving ahead is the best option. God has offered us great promises. I will never leave you nor forsake you. What I've begun in you, I will continue until the day of Christ Jesus, until it's complete. God gives us promises over and over. The coming of Christ, the winning of the lost to Jesus Christ. All these promises and many, many more. And some of you, He's put in your heart promises you're certain He's put there, and you're trusting in Him for them. Some of you have goals in your lives, and that goal's out ahead, and God's put the desire in your heart, and you're working toward that. But along the way, as you work toward it, as you move toward the promise, things arise that seem to attempt to stop you. It is in those times that we must remember this: moving forward in the promises of God. Moving forward in the promises of God will often require us to face loss, challenge, and trial. Just because we're moving forward in the promises of God does not then automatically eliminate us from the prospect of trial, from the prospect of disappointment, and from the prospect of loss. Once upon a time, there was a man named Abram. And God came to him, and He said, Abram, I want you to pick your family up and pick your stuff up, and I want you to leave, and I want you to go to a place I'll show you. And Abram picked his stuff up, picked his family up, and left, not knowing completely where he would go, but just with the promise of a God whom he had just met. just in the promise that not only would his family number the number of the grains of sand on the seashore, but that the land he would be given would be a great land, and that all the world would be blessed by him because of this promise. And Abram moved out and moved forward. And along the way, Abram, whose name would become Abraham, disappointment would arise. Things would happen with his family that caused him to have to resolve. Issues would come up, disappointments, doubts along the way, decades before even a small semblance of this promise would begin to be met. And finally, one of the great pegs of the promise, a son, came along. And the promise of a family and of a heritage that would dot the entire earth more than the stars in the sky, and of land that would be great. And as Abraham continued to follow this promise, he continued to have come in his path challenges and disappointments. And today we're going to look in Genesis chapter 23, where we're going to see how Abraham handles and faces one of the great disappointments of his life. If you have your Bibles with you, I want you to turn to Genesis chapter 23 as we learn what it means to simply be moving when God's promises seem to have stopped. When God's promises seem to be interfered with or interrupted, we're going to learn a little bit about what it means to simply continue moving. In fact, we're going to learn some steps from a man moving forward in faith. Some of you are here today, and the promises of God that are in your life seem to maybe have stalled to some degree. Or something has risen in your life that has disappointed you, that has discouraged you. And maybe you're not even at the point in your life of wanting to say it, but in the back of your mind, you're already thinking, what is God doing? Why is this happening? I thought He had laid in my life a desire for this. How many of you know that just because God has put promises in our lives, that does not mean we are exempt from trial and challenge and disappointment? In fact, so often, God will put those things in our lives just to offer us an opportunity to grow in the midst of them and to press forward, that is, move forward in the promises. Prior to this chapter, one of the great disappointments of Abraham's life was the fact that he had not yet given birth to a son of promise that God had promised him, and that went on for decades, and finally that came to be. We looked just a few weeks ago in chapter 21 of the book of Genesis on how Isaac was born. And the fulfillment, or the seeming fulfillment of God's promises began. It's an interesting thing, though, today's chapter, Genesis chapter 23, Abraham's life mate, his heartbeat, his wife of so many years passes. And here's the intriguing part. We're going to read the chapter of how Abraham deals with her passing, a wife of so many years. Some of you can relate to that. We're also going to see how he deals with her burial. But here's the thing. We're also going to look at how he responds when, in some ways, one might say the promise God has given Abraham of a lineage that will dot the entire earth. How that promise is handled when it seems that Sarah, his wife, dies and all he has is one son and no land. In fact, in this passage of Scripture, we might look at it and say, wow, that big promise God gave, that doesn't really seem to have come to fruition. Abraham's supposed to have so much family in his heritage and in his future that it's more than the sand on the seashore and the stars of the sky. He's supposed to have this great land. And when Sarah dies, his wife, who would give birth, there is only one son, and he doesn't have any property. But how many of you know Abraham would not stop? He would move forward in the promises. And I'm suggesting to you today, I don't know what's happening in your life to seemingly derail the promises you're convinced God's given you. I don't know what's going on in your family, in your finances, in your job, in your future. You're looking at something ahead and you're certain God's put it in your heart. And yet things are happening to seemingly state otherwise. What are some steps you can do to simply move forward? Because the fact is, we're not always moving in some great victory parade. Sometimes we're moving one small, difficult step at a time. Right? Sometimes we're running forward, praising God for what's going on in our lives, and sometimes we're just trudging through the sand. Either way, listen to me, either way, the key is in God's promises to be moving. Genesis chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, and we'll study this as we go through. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. So she was 127, which means Abram would have been somewhere in the neighborhood of about 137. That's a long time. And they'd been together a very, very, very long time. Some of you say, Pastor Johnny, I know the sting of losing someone with whom I have spent 30, 40, 50 years. It's a tough thing. It's a very difficult thing. So Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron. Later, it would become the city of Hebron. Now, understand something. Abraham and Sarah were living in what is now known as Israel. They were living in a place that would become the Promised Land. But thus far, we're before Moses. We're before Joshua conquering the Promised Land. We're before any of that. Really, at this point, Abraham is living in this land as a foreigner. He's renting. He's not owning yet. Verse 2. That is Hebron in the land of Canaan, and Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Just a note, that is the first record of tears in the Bible. We know there will be many, many more before the end, right? So here's Abraham. You think about this. I've got this promise of God. I'm going to have all these offspring, all these maybe millions of offspring, thousands and thousands of offspring. I'm going to have all this great land. My wife, who would give birth to some of those offspring, is now dead, and I've got one child. The land that God has promised. Well, I don't own any land at this point. I'm a vagabond of sorts. I travel. I'm here as a foreigner in a foreign land among people who are not my family. And so he mourns the loss of his dear, dear wife. Then Abraham stood up from before his dead. That is, he left the body and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, I am a foreigner and a visitor among you. Give me property for a burial place among you, that I may bury my dead out of sight. What does Abraham do when he loses his dear wife? His wife who would be the mother of seemingly all those children he's supposed to have. Of course, I get it today. There's no way Abraham could have seen the church of Jesus Christ, the church that is born spiritually from the seed of Abraham. We are Abraham's seed. And we see the billions of Christians who are all spiritually the seed of Abraham, right? No way Abraham could have seen that. Could he have been thinking, well, here's the end. What happened to the promise of God? Doesn't seem like it. So what does he do, Pastor Johnny? What does he do when the promise seems to be dying? Well, he faces a life-changing trial. His first step. First step, you want to move forward when it seems like God's promise has been disappointed? Then what do? The first thing you do is you simply face a life-changing trial moving. Now, Abraham, what does he do? He goes to look about burying his wife. Well, that's no great supernatural event. That's not some miracle. That's not a resurrection. No, but it is pressing forward, isn't it? Because sometimes the only thing you can do is just do the next step. And sometimes when you're disappointed, when it feels like you're discouraged, when it seems like the promise God put out ahead of you will not be resolved, will not come to fruition, you just look at life and say, you know what? I'm not sure what's ahead. I trust the Lord, so let me just do the next thing. For Abraham, the next thing was to figure out how he's going to bury his wife. Just a very real life event. Well, Pastor Johnny, that's not some great spiritual event. Sure it is. It's life. Can I tell you something? 98% of walking in the promises of God are just walking in the mundane of the everyday. 98% of what we do is just the day-to-day stuff. Every once in a while, the 2% of stuff where some great miraculous thing happens, sometimes God brings those things in our lives. But I'm telling you, most of where God has us walking is just in the mundane of the anonymous experiences of our lives that no one else knows about. You know, most pastors who preach, there are maybe 0.5% of all pastors who are known in a large area, maybe 0.1% who are known all over the world. I mean, the Billy Grahams of the world. How many of those are there? Well, just one. Has it really ever been? No one's ever been as well known as him as a preacher in history. There are the D.L. Moody's. There are the Billy Sundays. There are the modern-day David Jeremiahs and Charles Stanleys. The Tony Evanses out there that people worldwide know. But the fact is, those comprise about 0.1% of all pastors who are out there preaching. But I got to tell you, the other 99 and maybe 0.8% or 80% or 99.8% of pastors who are preaching will preach in churches where mainly their church members will know them and maybe people in the community. And by and large, outside of that, very few people know. They're just living in the day-to-day preaching, faithfully serving the Lord. And I was reminded of that years ago, and I bring this up now to say this. That is a great reflection, kind of a microcosm of where God has most Christians living. We're not called to be known worldwide. We're not even be called, most of us, to be known statewide. Maybe a lot of us aren't even that well known community-wide. We're just serving right where we are in our positions in our churches and our families and the promises of God, and He has us moving on, and that's okay because most of where we live is the mundane of every day. And so here's Abraham, his wife dies, and what's he going to do? What about the great promises of God? He's going to do the next thing. When you're disappointed and you're discouraged, I'm not sure you need to be looking for the great thing. Just look for the next thing. Oswald Chambers, his life philosophy used to be trust God and do the next thing. Facing a life-changing trial. Now look at verse 5. And the sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying to him, hear us, my Lord. The sons of Heth are a group, a community, a people among whom Abraham is living. Hear us, my Lord, verse 6. You are a mighty prince among us. What is their opinion of Abraham? A man who has just sojourned among them. Isn't one of them, but is out for what is their opinion of him? Guess what? In the mundane of everyday life, he has built a tremendous testimony among these people. Not doing shows, not filling arenas with thousands of people, just living his life, leading his family, going about God's will. And guess what he's done among the sons of Heth? He has built a tremendous testimony. It says right here in verse 6, you are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. None of us will withhold from you his burial place, that you may bury your dead. Then Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, the sons of Heth. Look at his response to them. What would you say, arrogant or a humble man? What would you say about Abraham? It says he bows himself before them. Wait, doesn't Abraham eventually become much greater than the sons of Heth? You better believe it. If I ask most Christians today who are the sons of Heth, they wouldn't know unless they're in this sermon today. Listen to this sermon today. But if I ask most Christians who's Abraham, we know him. At that time, though, Abraham was a servant to them. Abraham was living among them. He's coming to them to ask for a burial place in the promised land that's been promised to him. And he doesn't even own any of it yet. I got to tell you, sometimes it just seems like God's promises aren't getting done. Sometimes we're in the midst of it and it seems like, Lord, it seems so unlikely that what you said is going to happen is going to happen. How unlikely do you think for Abraham? I mean, he was having to go to people to ask them if he could just buy a small piece of land just to bury his dead. He doesn't even own a single acre in the promised land that he's been promised. How unlikely does God's promise seem to him at that moment? Verse 7 or verse 8. And he spoke with them, saying, if it is your wish that I bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and meet with Ephron, the son of Zohar, for me. Now, apparently Abraham had his eye on a piece of property. Verse 9, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he has, which is at the end of his field. Let him give it to me at the full price as property for a burial place among you. He's been facing a life-changing trial, and now he's simply following after a life-altering experience. What do you do? What do you do when the person that you love most on this earth is gone? How do you handle life? You press on. Is he going to do some great miraculous event? Is he going to take some great miracle step right here? All he's doing is trying to find a place to bury his wife. It's not something magnificent that will go down in the annals of history. It's just a man whose wife has died, who he loved with all of his heart. And now, after that life-changing event, he's trying to take the next step. He's simply living life following a life-altering experience. What has happened in your life that has made you really doubt the promises of God? What has happened in your life that has seemingly kind of just ruined God's future for you? What's happened? And then what do you do next? Here's what you do next. You simply take the next step following that life-altering experience. Whatever's next, as small as it may be, as large as it may be, take the step. There are sometimes folks that I minister to at funerals and in grievous situations where their hearts are broken. And in that moment, you know as well as I do, sometimes in that moment you feel like, how can I just go to the next day? My heart is so broken. How can I go to the next day? There's no other answer than just that next day, that small step. And I don't care if it's just getting up and brushing your teeth. It's just take the next step. You don't have to be a hero. You don't have to be a miracle worker. Just take the next step. And don't quit believing in the promises of God. Look at verse 10. Now Ephron dwelt among the sons of Heth. Ephron is the gentleman for whom Abraham asked his tomb. He asked for a cave on Ephron's land. He asked for that. He was going to buy the cave and he was going to bury Sarah there. So verse 10, we meet Ephron. Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the presence of the son of Heth, all who entered at the gate of this city, saying, now look at what's happening. They are at the gate of the city. The gate of the city was a place where major business transactions would take place in that day. The men sitting at the gate of the city would be leadership, maybe almost like the city council or governing leaders. And they would be there and they would hear different cases. They might hear cases of offense. They might hear cases just closing on property, like we might today go to a lawyer's office to close on land. That's what's happening here. They're doing a deal to exchange a piece of land. And Ephron says something interesting to Abraham. No, my Lord, hear me. I give you the field and the cave that is in it. Wait just a second. I want you to note something. Abraham had only asked for the cave. Abraham had not asked for the field. So we read this verse. I give it to you, verse 11, in the presence of the sons of my people. I give it to you, bury your dead. Someone might say, wow, what a great guy. He's trying to give this property to Abraham, and that is what I thought, but the more I study this, the more I realize in ancient times this is a bargaining process. It is a very cordial, a very, very kind exchange, but it is a bargaining process. There is a reason Ephron said, hey, take the cave, and the field. Translation, I'm not just going to sell you the cave, but I'll sell you the cave and the field. And I get that. Sometimes someone might want a piece of property, and we say, look, if I sell this piece of property to you, the property that's attached or the building that's attached becomes worthless. Maybe there's no access to the building if you take that property, so the only way I can sell it to you is to sell it all to you, not just that one piece of property. And some of you know the kind of thing I'm talking about. And so Ephron's saying, look, I'll give you the cave and the property. Really, translation, I'll sell you all of it or none of it. And Abraham says in verse 12, he bowed himself down before the people of the land. And he spoke to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, saying, if you will give it, please hear me. I will give you money for the field. Take it from me, and I will bury my dead there. Essentially, Abraham says, okay, I'll buy the cave and the field. Verse 14. And Ephron answered Abraham, saying to him, my Lord, listen to me. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. That is, okay, if you insist, I'll sell it to you. But what is that between you and me? That is a colloquialism, a phrase that, hey, no big deal, I'll sell it to you for 400 shekels. Now, he wasn't really giving Abraham a good deal on the land. He was just giving him a reasonable deal. This wasn't an especially cheap price. It was a reasonable price. By the way, this is, to my knowledge, the first business exchange we have recorded in the Bible. Very interesting chapter, some very unique firsts. Again, verse 15. My Lord, listen to me. The land is worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? So bury your people. Verse 16. And Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out the silver for Ephron, which he had named in the hearing of the sons of Heth. It's all being done according to proper protocol in front of the witnesses. 400 shekels of silver, currency of the merchants. They do it properly. Abraham does it correctly. He does it according to their means. Now remember, Abraham is not really one of their citizens. He's renting. He's not owning yet. And yet, he goes out of his way to make sure he does the business deal according to their business principles in that place. Could he have done it another way? I don't know. He may have had enough men. We know that when he went and took Lot back from the people who had kidnapped Lot and his family, Abraham had a pretty formidable army. Could he have come in and just taken this property? Possibly. But that wasn't God's plan for him. Watch this. Pastor Johnny, how do we move forward in the midst of a time when it seems that the promises of God have been disappointed? Watch this. Abraham did it by faithfully living above reproach. Abraham did it by faithfully living above reproach. Now listen to me. In this passage, there are some spiritual applications that run a lot deeper than what we're addressing here. I've got that. There are things that look at and can reflect and look even into New Testament promises that are eventually fulfilled. But I see here just a man who is in the midst of one of the great promises of God. And time again, Isaac wasn't born, Ishmael was born. Isaac wasn't born for decades, and all of a sudden he was. Then Abraham was challenged to sacrifice his son Isaac. And over again, the promise seems to be foiled, and yet Abraham never stops pressing forward. He faithfully lives above reproach. How about this? Pastor Johnny, what do I do next? It seems like the promises of God are being foiled. How about this? You say, bless God, I'm going to live to the glory of God in my life. And whatever happens next, I'm going to live in such a way to honor God in the presence of people. I'm not going to undermine the testimony of Jesus Christ in my life. I want to glorify God. Maybe people are looking at me and saying that poor crazy woman, that poor crazy man, they really think they've got this thing ahead, and maybe nobody else believes in it. That's all right. Live above reproach, as Abraham did. And that's just a day-to-day thing, isn't it? Keep living moment by moment above reproach. Listen, there are men I know of in this world who went before me, who are men now people would look back on their lives and say, what great men of God. But I know that in their lives things happen along the way that were heartbreaking and were disturbing and were disappointing and discouraging. And in the moments they faced those things, it was probably in their minds, do I just give up? But they didn't. They continued to press forward and live to the glory of God. And when they finally went to meet the Lord, when they finally went to be with the Lord, people look back on their lives and say, what great men of God, and how greatly their lives impacted people. Now, in the moments where their promises of God were being discouraged, in the moments where it seemed like the promises of God were being foiled, maybe they didn't think that. But living toward the promises of God is not a one moment or a 2 moment thing. It's a moment by moment by moment thing the rest of your life. And at any given moment, it may not seem like God's there. Pastor Johnny, it's been longer than a moment. It's been a year. A year is a moment in the economy of God. And I'm not trying to belittle your hurt or your discouragement. I'm just saying, a year, 2 years, 5 years that you've been facing something. Really, that's a moment in the economy of God. Oswald Chambers, in his book, Abandoned to God, it's a biography of Oswald Chambers. If you haven't read it, I strongly encourage Christians to read biographies. I love biographies because I'm reading about people who just lived their lives to the glory of God, and how encouraging it is to see how absolutely normal some of the greatest men and women of the faith really were. It said about Oswald Chambers how he was a trickster and a jokester, and he pulled practical jokes on people. And you read that his great devotional, My Utmost for His Highest, and you picture him, this man who always had coat and tie buttoned up, starched, and always never quite laughing, just always kind of melancholy. That's not at all who he was. He was a cut-up. And yet one chapter of his biography, Abandoned to God, the title of it is The Dark Night of the Soul. And he speaks of a year of his life, over a year, where he was well into ministry. He was teaching and he was ministering and he was leading people to the Lord, and he was ministering to groups of people. And for one solid year, maybe a little more, he actually seriously doubted his salvation. And he walked through this year and he thought he would never come out of it. And it took well over a year. Well, while he was in the midst of it, it seemed to be taking forever. And people on the outside, he didn't tell anybody on the outside. People just saw him and they thought he was just the normal Oswald. And on the inside, he was dying. And what seemed to take forever to him really was only a year. And when he looked back on it later in his life, a year doesn't seem like that long. When you're in the midst of it, it seems like forever. It's like when you get burnt by the stove. I mean, the burn may last, in the initial burn a few seconds, and later maybe an hour or so. But boy, it seems like forever when it's happening. And really, it's not that long. Well, when we're facing trials in our lives trying to follow the promises of God, the things we're facing at the moment seem so long. Yet the reality is they're just a moment. And like Abraham, he just continued to take the steps that would bring glory to God in those moments. Verse 17. So the field of Ephron, which was in Machpelah, which was before Mamre, the field and the cave which was in it, and all the trees that were in the field, which were within all the surrounding borders, were deeded to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the son of Heth before all who went in at the gate of the city. So verse 17 and 18 are essentially, they closed on the land. It's now officially Abraham's land. It's that time where you sit in the lawyer's office and you sign 372 pieces of paper. And you finally finish signing, they hand you the keys, and you walk out of there. Now you own that property. At least you're in debt paying for the property you now own, right? So you've finished it. You've closed the deal, and so is Abraham. Interesting to me, Abraham is buying a piece of property. Let me clarify something. He understands it won't just be Sarah buried here. He will be buried in this property. Isaac, Jacob, their family. Listen, this is Abraham's, this is his faith. He's buying a piece of property that will bury his family for years to come in a land where he doesn't own property at all. He don't have but one son. Why would he need to be buried? Why would he need to buy some big burial plot to bury a bunch of family members who are going to come? We only got one son. Because he absolutely trusted the promise of God. And so finally, Abraham owns a little property in the promised land. One little bitty field and a cave that'll be his family's burial plot. Go figure. Verse 19. And after this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave that is in it were deeded to Abraham by the sons of Heth as property for a burial place. Now it's interesting, if you look at verses 18, 19, and 20, it seems like when Moses wrote the book of Genesis, he repeated himself an awful lot. Because it basically says 2 or 3 times from verses 17 through 20 that the land was deeded to Abraham. That Abraham bought the land. Just trying to reinforce this idea. Abraham is a man of faith. He believes the promise of God. He's buying a field in the promised land, a field where he'll bury his family for years to come. And he don't even own anything else in the land at this point and has no more family. At the point where the promise seemed the bleakest, Abraham's moving. He's moving on. And so what do we do when we're faced with something that seems like it's destroying the promise of God in my life? We move by, watch this, by finally leaving anguish behind. When he buried Sarah, now certainly in his heart, he was still sad. Certainly in his heart, he was still brokenhearted, missing his wife, his friend. And yet it was time. He had to bury her. He had to take care of business, and then he had to press forward. I don't have any great secrets for you. Sometimes facing anguish. All I can tell you is when you're facing something that seems to destroy the promise of God, don't stop trusting in God's promise. That doesn't mean it's gone away. Just because one 6-hour period, just because one 7-day period, just because one 6-month period seems to imply to you that God's promises are no longer valid, it doesn't mean they are. It doesn't mean they've stopped. You keep pressing forward step by step, moment by moment, day by day. Moving forward in the promises of God will require you and me to face loss, challenge, and trial. The name William Wilberforce, well known in the circles of Great Britain. Young Wilberforce would spend his life battling the slave trade in England. And listen very closely to this. Finally, toward the end of his life, the slave trade would be eliminated and he would be credited with it. He fought it for decades and decades with very little support. One story tells of the young William Wilberforce. By the way, if you haven't seen the movie Amazing Grace, how many of you have seen that? If you haven't seen it, I exhort you to go get a copy of it, rent a copy, buy a copy, download a copy, whatever, and watch it. Great story of a man of faith. Wilberforce was a man of God. Loved the Lord. In fact, for a while, he debated whether to go into politics or to become a preacher. Well, there's a story about young William Wilberforce who was discouraged one night. It was the early 1790s, and he had already fought a 10-year battle against the slave trade. He was very young when he entered Parliament, in his early 20s. So 10 years later, he was still just 31, 32 years old, still a young man, and had already fought for 10 years. He was tired and frustrated. And the story goes that he opened his Bible, and out of his Bible fell a piece of paper, and it fluttered to the floor. The piece of paper, listen, the piece of paper was the last letter John Wesley had ever written, the founder of Methodism, the great preacher. The last letter John Wesley ever wrote was a letter to William Wilberforce just before Wesley died. Wesley wrote this letter. He was in his 90s. And then some weeks later, he died. Wilberforce picked up the letter and he read it. And one section of the letter said this: "Young William, unless the divine power has raised you up, I see not how you can go through your glorious enterprise in opposing that abominable practice of slavery, which is the scandal of religion, of England, and of human nature. Unless God has raised you up for this very thing, you will be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. But if God be for you, who can be against you? Are all of them together stronger than God? Oh, be not weary of well-doing, young William. Go in the name of God and in the power of His might. And for many years after that, William Wilberforce, because of a calling by God, his pastor was the author of the hymn Amazing Grace, who called him. In fact, there's one great scene in the movie, and it's an actual experience where he told William, you can't become a preacher when God wants you in Parliament, basically. And for years after, William Wilberforce would press forward in the fight, knowing this, that God called him. And at times it seemed like it would never happen till it finally did. And I'm telling you today, I don't know what promise God's given you. I don't know what in His life He's doing. I don't know what dream He's given you. I don't know what hope He's given you. But I'm saying there are going to be days where it feels like it's not going to happen. Sometimes it seems like there are more days where it feels like it's not going to happen than days where it feels like it will. And in those days, you remember a man named Abraham, who all he could do was just simply keep moving. And you're here today and you say, Pastor Johnny, you don't know what I'm facing, but it just seems like I'm so discouraged. Can I suggest to you that you just take the next step? What's that? Well, maybe your next step is simply getting down here on your face before the Lord and pouring your heart out to God. It's not some great miraculous step. It's just a simple act. Could I suggest to you today, listen, could I suggest to you that what God's calling you to today is to come and say, Pastor Johnny, you know what I need? I need to know for certain whether I'm a child of God. I don't even know for certain whether I'm saved. I don't even know for certain whether I've been born again or if I'll spend eternity in heaven. And maybe your next step is just coming and saying, Pastor, can I speak with someone about how to be saved? And we'll get you with someone who can go sit down in a room down the hall and talk with you about how to be saved. And at the very, very least, to make sure you understand what it means so you'll know today if that's something you've done in your life. And if you're not certain today of whether you're saved, if you're not certain whether you're born again, there's a good sense in my mind that maybe you're not. I don't know, but maybe that's your next step. Maybe your next step is something as absolutely practical as saying, Pastor Johnny, it's time for me and my family to become a part of this fellowship. God's leading us to serve Him. And our next step, as far as I know, is just simply to become a part of what He's doing here. And you want to come and say, Pastor Johnny, can you tell us how we can join? And we'll begin the process of that. Or maybe your next step is simply going and sitting down with another believer in this church and just praying with them. I'm going to pray, and then I'm going to just ask you to respond. I'm going to pray, and we're going to stand and sing. I'm just going to ask you to respond to God's leading. Father, right now, in Jesus' name, help us that we might be obedient to you, Father, right now.